You saw how the shader tree worked in the previous video. Let's go a step further and not use procedurals entirely and put some image maps on our snake. So what I'm going to do is load up our Snake 6 example. That's this guy right here. And you can load that up. I'm going to save this as 7 so that if you load up 6, it should look exactly the same. So I did a save incremental. That means it's version 7. So you saw that with the snake body, we could put some procedurals on. I had a simple green texture on here, or excuse me, a green material, just a deep green like that. And we had put some procedural noise on there and made some bump maps. But what if I really wanted to use more of a skin on there? And and as I'm doing this, I'm looking, remember earlier when we had created our material groups, it looks like I missed a polygon right there. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select polygon, select that polygon right there, press M, and reassign that to the snake body. And there we go. I can see that updated in my preview. If I wanted to add a snake skin, I would add an image map. Now, we went to the add layer in the previous video and added some custom materials and some bump maps and everything else. You can also add an image map. Now, you would do this for roadways, labels, pictures, whatever you want when you need some sort of image inside Modo. You can load an image sequence as well, and you can create an image, which we'll talk about when we get to painting. But for right now, let's hit Load Image. And then in your Images folder, as part of the Projects folders, you can see that there is Snake Eye and SnakeSkin. I'll call this up here real quick. What this is a piece of fabric, I believe. It was just this leathery kind of snakeskin fabric my wife had for a drapery job. And I colored it green. This was a number of years ago and just kind of pushed it around. And it's really a terrible looking image, but it'll work for what we're doing. So with that selected, I'm going to click Open. And you can see that it applies it as best it can. In fact, it does a really good job. And 15 years ago, well, that might have actually been okay. But you can go a lot further with it these days. And let me just show you a couple of image mapping options. So with the snake skin image attached to the material group snake body, you can see down here that the texture locator shows its position, its rotation, and its size. The projection type by default is UV map. We never made a UV map for this. It's something that you might want to do. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I'll go over some UVs with you. But we could try some of the other mapping options. The projection types in Modo are actually really pretty good. Back in the day, it was always just planar, which was, something tiled like that, and you could do X, Y, or Z axis. You can also go to cylindrical and change the axis down the X, and it would wrap it that way. And none of them are quite right for what we need to do. So you would think normally that you would have to do UV map. And UV maps allow you to map on non-standard shapes. For instance, something like this. It allows you to create one image map, and it knows where all the data goes. So I can create one image map for the mouth, for the eyes, for the skin, and all of it will place exactly right. The other advantage is that it will map along these curves around this way and around this way, whereas a planar, and you can even see here just with if I go, let's say, to a box method, it will stretch it, and you can even see it just stretching right in here. So what do we do for this without going through UV map? And UV maps are not always the answer. Everybody thinks, oh, it's the holy grail of texturing, and depending on what it is, games, of course, things like that, but it takes some time to set those up properly. So that is why there's all these different options here. And what you can do then is use one of the brand new features in Modo 601. So let's just come down here and choose a planar image map. In fact, I'm going to choose solid. Just do that. And what solid will do is just wrap this all around, kind of like it's just sort of wallpapered on there. Works really well. But don't worry about the shading just yet. We'll go back here to our size. Now our size is set to 1 meter. I'll click the gang select once, and then I'll click and drag on the arrows, and you can see that I'm sizing up that texture so it's a little more accurate on there. But the problem is that my image from Photoshop is all messy, which is one reason I chose it. The shading is not right. It's not a seamless tiled image. You can clearly see that it's just, stretched down. And what we used to do in the past was put a fractal noise texture over this just to kind of cover up the seams. Well, the fine folks at Luxology have gone one better than that. they created texture replicators. And what this will do is blend this. It'll replicate the texture across that surface. Well, how does it work? Well, we need to choose a particle source. And of course, that particle source will be the snake body. And let's just choose that. And what you'll see is it looks like it disappears, but it doesn't. We have to consider the particle size. Well, back in my transform, I made my image size 6 meters. Let's jump this to 6 meters. Now, a little bit big, and that's okay, but you can certainly see that it's working. Let me just now gradually bring this down, and I'll show you how this is working. And what this is doing is literally taking each of these points and blending this texture out from it. All right, so what I'm going to do then is just kind of get this sized about where I want, looking at each one of these. And I think right about there might be good. And then we're going to play with the fall off, so it doesn't fall off quite as much. And then we'll move the gain back down. And you can see how it sharpens those edges. All right, so what happens now if that's the size I want, but it's not filling everything up? What we'll do is we'll come back here to transform, and we're going to bring these values back down. Okay, because if I need to increase my particle size, but my image is showing too large, then I just bring the image size down. So I'm going to bring my particle size up so that these are all blending. And it looks like I got them all pretty well. This is something you're going to see in the render, not in the OpenGL, so you got to wait till this redraws here. Okay. So it looks like it covered it all. And we'll rotate back. It starts to chunk down a little bit because there's a lot of calculation. We'll go back to transform, and now I'm going to actually take my size back down. The actual size of the image. Let's just keep going here. A little bit more. And I'm watching the preview render as well. Here's a little thing too. If you move your mouse over an area in the preview render, it will render that area first. Okay. And that looks like about the right size that I want. So what's happening here is that Modo is replicating this texture across this entire surface based on the points of that surface. And now we get this perfectly blended, great looking texture. And that's just the base, because then from here we can actually add shading and bumps and use this texture again to create all the little details we want. So it looks a little soft to me, right? And it's not because the base material is green. It's just the way the image is being applied as a diffuse color. You can change it to diffuse amount, but I actually want to see the actual image. So diffuse color is truly what we need. We don't need to come in and use diffuse amount or clear coat or dissolve or anything else at this point. Just that. So how do we get that to show a little bit stronger? That's where the gamma comes in. And I'm going to take gamma down to just half of what it is. It defaults at 1. I'll bring it to 0.5, and it's going to give me some strength, some contrast in that image. Let that redraw. Now, the specularity I'm not really happy with here. And I want the specularity to fall in and out of these bumps. And I can do that by changing this material here. So what I'll do is right-click on the SnakeSkin and create an instance. And earlier when I showed you how instances work, remember they're going to be a copy of the original. So whatever I change in terms of size and placement on this original, this instance will follow. Which is good because all I'm going to do with this one is change it from diffuse color to a specular amount. And what you'll see is that the specularity then falls in and out of the light and dark areas of that image. And then when we go back to material and we increase the roughness, and we don't want that much, but I'll do it so you can see it, the light will fall in and out of there. But what's going to give it even more realism is making a bump map. So we'll come back to the SnakeSkin diffuse color, right click, create another instance, right click on the effect, and under surface shading make it a bump. And my system's going to come to a screeching halt at this point because it's a little taxing on my little tiny processors. Let me just move this over here. And so what's happening now is that the high and low values in the image, in that snakeskin image, are determining the bump value and determining the shine, the specular value. Not how much of the shine, but where it really gets applied. And we'll let this redraw here. And what I'm going to do is just press F9 so you can see a real render, and we'll cut ahead so you can see what that looks like. All right, just zooming ahead, you can see that this render took 20 minutes. It takes a lot of time to process this, but I'm not working on the fastest computer. But you can see that that simple texture that we had with the varying edges and everything else is actually blending just fine with the texture replicator. And then with a little bit of bump and then the specularity set also to that image, you can see that that light falls in and out of those curves. Works really well. So if we wanted a little more bump, what we would do is just come down to the material itself. We'll let this thing catch up. There we go. And down at the very bottom, you can see under the surface normal, there is the bump amplitude. That's the amount of bump. Our grid spacing is 500 millimeters. Every little square is 500 millimeters. So this is only 5 millimeters. So let's go to 100 millimeters, which is just a portion of that. And now we'll actually be able to see a little bit more bump on there. Give that a little refresh. And then for the shader itself, you want it kind of wet. If you want it wet looking, you would bring the roughness down. So I'd bring it down to maybe about 20%. So the amount of shine is okay, but just it's a little too glossy. And you can see it right there in the OpenGL. Let's get a little bit more in there. We'll bring this up maybe about 60. And then I'm going to tint this just to kind of a duller greenish gray. And let's save that. All right, so that is how you can put the texture replicators to use. It works really well for rocks and ground and texture. I've done so many grass and dirt things over the year where if the camera angle is just right, you can kind of see that repeating pattern. And it's a really terrific way to avoid seeing that. Now let's go to the eye material. And we'll do another image map. I'm going to turn off our SnakeSkin just for the time being so it's not calculating. And what I want to do with this, with the eye, real simply, is just use our texture on there. So we'll do the same thing. We're going to add layer, image map, load image, and then use the snake eye. And then from texture locator, let's use auto size. UV map is by default. We really can get away with a planar. Everybody thinks you always need a round object for a round projection type for a round object. That's not always the case. I use planar for a lot of things. But what this allows me to show you is that very simply we can just place that on there, but then I get to use my rotation and position tools. So that image is selected, it's on the eyes. Here's the position. Let's move it up. Just click and drag a little bit on the arrows. And then for rotation, we can rotate it around the Y like this. And you could honestly animate like this too if you wanted. And it gives the impression that the eyeball itself is moving. And briefly I showed you earlier how quickly you can set up an animation just by clicking any of these little dots right here. So I'm just going to keep this one just like this. Now the only issue then is our other eye. What's going to happen to that? That's going to be an opposite of what we have on the other side. The problem is it's facing the wrong way. Now if I go ahead and rotate this again, you'll see this eye rotating. Okay. And let me go to my render, global illumination, hit enable. I'll just bounce some light in there. All right, so now that one's looking forward, but then we have the issue of this one. Okay, so because it's the same material on the same, and we're applying the same image map to both, it's rotating opposite. That image is being applied all the way through. So really what I would do is put left eye, right eye, making it very simple just to do 2 image maps, and you can copy and paste and then adjust. So let's come back over to this eye right here. I'll rotate a little bit around. Go to polygon mode, and let's just double click on that eye. And this eyeball, press M for polygon set material. We have eyes. Now we're going to do, it'd be his right eye. And then I'm going to take this snake eye material here. I'm going to right click and say duplicate. And then I'm going to move it up right on top there. So now that one is faced the right way. And then let's make sure back here we rotate this one back around the way we needed. And I'm also going to take this right eye. I'm going to drag that material group down over the other one that says eyes. And I'm also going to right click on here and rename this because it's good to stay organized. We'll call it left eye. And we'll change the image materials. Yes. And we'll take that image, texture locator, and let's just rotate it back around. And then we're good to go. And we'll save that. So very easy to do the eyes just with an image map. You don't necessarily need a bump map on here. I know people create a lens. We've done that before in other training where you've got a aqueous coating and all of these things. Honestly, this works well for a lot of things, just fine. You know, it depends on how close and what you really need to do if you have to animate inside there. You can also come down here to the gamma like we did earlier and make this more contrasty. So 0.5 might be a little bit much. I'm going to go 0.7. Just punch that a little bit, a little more contrast in there. If you want to play with the shine of it, of course, it's an eyeball, so it's going to be a little glossier. So we're going to have a higher specularity and a little bit lower roughness there. And then finally for the interior of the mouth, we'll come here to material. We're going to make this base just a deep kind of pinkish red like this. That's almost even too colorful. Should probably be a little more grayish. Like that. And then let's get our image map to place in there.